Well, welcome to the History Shelf, everyone. My name is Peg, and I just want to introduce this author interview you're about to see. Uh, this was a fantastic discussion with Jeffrey E. Stern, the author of The Warhead, The Quest to Build the Perfect Weapon in the Age of Modern Warfare, put out by Dutton Books. This came out earlier this year. I read and reviewed it. I loved this book. So you're in for a treat. Jeff and I spoke for about an hour or more. Could have talked for far longer. There's so much in this book. It is very human centric. Jeff is an amazing storyteller. And yes, we're on a first name shortened basis. So please enjoy this interview. And if you're interested in reading The Warhead, I do encourage you to go out and check it out. I also have an extra copy, a finished copy, hardcover copy of The Warhead that I will be doing a giveaway for. So all I'm asking is that you watch our interview and then email me. Look for my business email address, which is in my About tab on my YouTube homepage. And email me. Tell me you'd like to be entered into the giveaway for The Warhead, but also tell me what was the most interesting thing about the book that Jeff or I talked about in the interview, just so I know that, you really watched. And like I said, I rarely glow about books, but this one was so masterfully written. It was fantastic, and I can't wait to reread it. So without further ado, let's get into the interview. But if you're interested, please email me and let me know so I can enter you into the giveaway for The Warhead. Well, hey, Jeff, thank you for joining me here on the History Shelf for this interview. Really appreciate your time today as we talk about, as your recent book, The Warhead. So you can get that to focus. The Quest to Build the Perfect Weapon in the Age of Modern Warfare. Just as a little bit of a backstory for viewers. I read and reviewed this book. When did this come out again, Jeff? I feel like it's been close to
end of January.
Okay,
yeah, no, about 5 months, almost 5 months.
Oh my God! In the book reviewing world, that 5 months is like 2 years. You know what
I
I'm
know.
saying?
Yeah.
So a very recent book. Raved about it, loved it. And we're here today to talk about The Warhead. First of all, let me just say to anyone out there, don't be confused by the title or the image on this book. This book is a very human-centered book. This is a book that tells stories and does it so well. Jeff, I loved your writing. You just hooked me from the get-go, and I gave it 5 stars.
Thank you so much, Fake. I really appreciate that, especially as someone who can tell if I'm getting things wrong on the technical aspect.
Yeah, no, this just hit on all cylinders. But for our viewers, if you could just tell us a little bit about yourself. I know your background is in journalism, and you've reported from some pretty intense places. If you could just give us a little bit more about yourself before we start.
Yeah, so I sort of started out as a freelance war correspondent, for lack of a better term. So we're trying to make a career, first in Afghanistan, and over the years got involved in a couple of other kind of longer form magazine style kind of conflict reporting, largely conflict reporting, and then also some various sort of NGO efforts to support the habit. One of my last kind of big magazine investigations was actually about airstrikes in Yemen, unpacking this one particular incident, one airstrike that had happened on a well in northern Yemen, and trying to trace the weapon used back to the people who had built it. And that was a sort of the approach that I would always try to take, which was, I am sort of an expert in nothing, but would get very interested in some new thing that other way smarter, more experienced journalists had been covering for a while. And so would sort of try to apply, the beginner's eye to it. How do we get people who are not necessarily interested in this issue interested in this issue.
Mhm.
And so I think a couple of the advantages that I had born from disadvantages from very early on. I didn't have, a lot of stature or status. I didn't really have connections to the senior politician for comment, or the most senior general to tell me how, war XYZ was going. So kind of by default, I ended up having to spend a lot of time with, for lack of a better word, kind of the normal people, the man or woman on the street. And so whereas I think a lot of journalism is about kind of giving a picture, a broad picture of what is the breadth and scope of what's going on, and then I'm going to give you this little example of this guy on the street reflecting on it. Mine was
Mhm.
always kind of reversed, where all I have is this guy on the street, so I'm going to try to build the entire thing out of him or her,
Mhm.
and try to bring a reader who starts out knowing as much as I knew, which is usually very little, and try to get them to sort of uh, not just know, but ideally kind of like feel, as much as possible what it's like to be in this particular situation. Um, Ideally as a way, to potentially educate about, the broader scope and structure of whatever the incident is. And
That's a Yeah, that's a very interesting approach. It's almost like a reverse engineering of storytelling, right?
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, so you're going to the effect and then searching it back to the cause, you know?
yeah, yeah.
Wow.
And I
Mhm.
think I mean, this is a bit of, uh, a friend of mine calls this conclusion-based evidence finding. But one of the kind of reverse engineering ways I sort of articulate this as a master strategy that I had from the beginning, which I did not, but is, there is this thing that can happen kind of like, we call it empathy collapse, right? Where if you have a massive humanitarian crisis and 2 million people are on the brink of starvation or something, and then you have, you know, a true crime thing about the missing girl down the street, it's way easier to sort of worry about and identify and envision the one person,
Mhm.
than it is this sort of massive thing. The way I often put it is like, what does that look like? Several million people in the case of Yemen on the brink of famine. Is that, 4 stadiums or 10 stadiums or 100 stadiums? I mean, you literally kind of can't
Yeah.
envision that. And so I think it's almost, if you're trying to get people to um, know or be interested or care, it actually can be more effective to kind of narrow the aperture a little bit and focus
Yeah.
more on the smaller number of people.
Absolutely, and it's so much more, even though I hate to use the word impactful.
Right. Yeah. Don't even try. I stumble across the sort of unintended puns with this book constantly.
Oh, I bet you do. I didn't mean to
Yeah.
add to it. Um, but yeah, I so and then you actually begin this book with a very personal story about what an interaction you had in Yemen. If
Mhm.
you'd like to tell the viewers about that.
Yeah. So Yemen, aside from this author's note, just to be clear, obviously, I mean, Yemen is not in the book, even though the book came out of this one experience in Yemen and this one magazine story. But so it's this story I was describing where, like, again, typically I knew almost nothing about Yemen, and I had learned about this, catastrophe that was happening in conjunction with these airstrikes. I mean, probably a year or 2 years into it having happened, and I remember feeling a little bit of a almost like embarrassment. I like to
Mhm.
consider myself someone generally aware of what's going on in the world, and I just had not been paying attention to this. And so was kind of thinking about like what, why that is and how to kind of penetrate that. And I think one of the things again is this sort of, it was, obviously it's far away, it's behind blockade, it's hard to get to, that's matters, but also it was so big,
Yeah.
that I think it's sort of hard to, um, so that story was trying to really zoom in on this, just a small number of people in this remote part of northern Yemen, um, who had been digging a water well. And the night that it hit water and they were out there celebrating, the drill was struck, in a precision attack, using U.S. made weapons. I also knew nothing about, U.S. made munitions at all,
Mhm.
but um, that story is for the New York Times Magazine, and they assigned a weapons expert to sort of help track the weapon back to where it was made.
Mm.
There was this one. This is a sort of long setup for the anecdote that's in the author's note is when I was there in northern Yemen, which was several months after this had happened, but trying to recreate it, interviewing people. And at one moment, we were in someone's living room, all sitting on the carpet, chewing cat, which is the thing you do, and drinking tea. And there was a guy who said to me, or to my interpreter, he kind of leaned forward and said, "Touch my face." It was kind of confused moment, but he literally like leaned his face towards me, crawled across the carpet and leaned his face towards me so that I could touch the shrapnel that was still stuck in his eye because he had been injured in this attack. And it was just this, obviously a very intense moment, but it was this sort of like, I think the term I used was intimacy of like, these two people that are like, like literally touching each other.
Mhm.
And thinking about how hard it had been first for me to learn about this thing that was happening, largely because of U.S. weapons and support and material support. Also because of just how hard it was to get there, having to find a way to get visas to two parts of the country that are at war, and fly into the south and go up in disguise, and then how easy it was for the weapon to get there.
Mm-hmm.
And so those, the how hard it had been for these two people to connect, and how easy it was for someone in the Oval Office or whatever to say, sell a weapon to those guys and have them use it and drop it, in a matter of, could be days or hours, was in a way kind of one of the points of the book, kind of encapsulated in this one moment.
Mm-hmm. Is that where you got the idea? Is that where the seed was starting to germinate, maybe from that encounter? And then you thought, let's look into smart weapons, or how did this all happen?
So that's giving me a little bit too much credit. That is sort of how I articulate it now. I think it did. I think the sort of the tension between the technological and the human, and particularly around distance, was something that I was sitting with for a while. I think that initially the idea for the book for me was just a way to tell a bunch of different stories about people in different places, and using this device, this one weapon, to me was, for a while, was no more than a convenient literary device, a sort of baton that could be passed, that could give me the excuse to just write a bunch of different interesting stories. Obviously, as the thing began to take shape, I mean, it really had to be a book. It had to be kind of a history of this thing, and to get more into the impact of it. But one of the I think major influences of this particular guided weapon, and the class of weapons that it kind of ushered in, was removing people from warfare, from in the conception of warfare. The extreme end of the spectrum is a closed loop, AI killer robot that is engaging a target and dispatching it without much involvement from a human. But this is kind of the beginning of that, where you have a very inexpensive, easy to use, very ostensibly precise weapon, that you can put on a plane and then hit somewhere behind enemy lines in some country that maybe most Americans haven't even heard of. And you put it on a drone, and you can have a private in a Creech Air Force Base or something, sitting in an air-conditioned trailer, and push a button, and thousands and thousands of miles away, there's an explosion. And so part of what that moment helps encapsulate is trying to bring people back into war, and trying to use this thing, that is a agent of disconnection, actually as an agent of connection. This is the thing that allows to connect different people.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's I never even thought of it like that. Yeah, an agent connection. Well, I have to say, after that author's note, and then full force at the beginning of the book just grabs me. I had known about Joseph Kennedy. I knew he was a pilot in World War II. I knew he died in World War II. I did not know he died in this way. Like, he was like, that is so, like I say, people, you got to read this book, because he grabs you right away. Jeff gets you, man. He gets you right at the seat of your pants. And it is so dramatic. Could you
Thank you.
tell us again, that leads us into the whole story as we move into the technology and how it developed and also the moral implications, and we'll touch on that later. But the story of Joseph, P. Kennedy Jr., right?
Mhm.
Jr.
Yep.
And how he was kind of like a human. He was
Yeah.
the human heat-seeking missile because
Right.
I'll let you
Yeah.
tell the story.
So so at the tail end of World War II, um, the Hitler was developing these vengeance weapons, and there was the V1 and the V2, which were like really kind of just designed to lay siege to cities, to sort of terrorize people.
Yeah.
They were, aerodynamically advanced for their time. They were not at all precise. They weren't supposed to be, but they were tools of terror, of vengeance. And
Mhm.
um, the Allies, partially through the French underground and through aerial reconnaissance, began to put together this picture of V3, of the third vengeance weapon that was being developed. One of the places it was being developed was in a bunker in Nazi occupied France. And the reports were that this thing was going to be, they were going to be like 7 meter long projectiles, like several times the speed of sound, and aimed at London. It would have made, if it got up and running, it would have made the Blitz, look tame. And so there was this push to find a way to destroy this bunker, destroy this weapon before it got up and running. Um, and there were a bunch of different sort of cockamamie plans that people came up with to try to do it. But fundamentally, the problem was there wasn't really a way to get enough explosive power close enough to the bunker while still returning safely.
Okay.
Um, and so basically, the solution became, well, what if we remove return safely from the equation? And so using what was still a relatively new technology, which was television, they outfitted war-weary bombers, World War II bombers, kind of brought them back from the scrap heap, removed every single nut and bolt that wasn't absolutely necessary for flight, um, packed them with torpedo explosives, and then put a TV camera on the front. And the idea was the plane would take off, there'd be a mother and a baby. The baby would
Mhm.
be this plane, but it would be flown by remote control. The mothership would be a little bit behind
Right.
and would have a monitor and be able to read it. And the early testing, they kind of figured out how to fly the plane remotely with this sort of rudimentary system of rods and levers, but taking off was still too complicated a maneuver to do without having someone in the cockpit. So the solution was, what we'll do is we'll put a pilot and a co-pilot in. They'll take off in the baby, in the bomb, basically, and then they'll parachute out once the connection is established. Which was relatively novel because it's parachuting at something like 200 miles per hour. But they did testing. Um, and so Joe Kennedy went up in one of the, inaugural flights of this flying bomb, and essentially the bomb detonated before he could parachute out.
Yeah.
Um,
Wow. Yeah, that
so
was just a revelation for me. I was just like, did not know it was in relation to this.
right,
And, and that it was in pursuit of, like, this emerging technology, like, using, yeah, television signals between a mother and a baby. I'm just like, "Wow, this is
yeah,
incredible."
yeah,
Wow.
and part of part of the reason for having that there, for starting with that, um, is because if there, it's hard to come up with a more noble project. A no a more there's hard to come up with a more noble kind of ambition, at least in wartime, than to try to destroy a weapon that's going to kill thousands and thousands of civilians.
Yeah.
Um, and I think arguably, Joe Kennedy died because one of the reasons was because the technology wasn't mature enough yet.
Mhm.
Um, and so partly to try to prevent, you know, well, weapons are bad, war is bad, these are bad people who make them, so I know what I'm getting into when I started reading this book. I kind of wanted you to kind of be leaning forward, to kind of want this thing to be, to want a better solution to be invented.
Yeah.
Um, so that it becomes a little bit harder to kind of externalize the, they're not really villains who are putting these things together. Largely, they're people trying to come up with solutions, like they were trying to come up with Joe Kennedy to defeat the Nazis.
Right. So the
So,
intent was there to there was good intent.
mhm,
Um, and so
mm,
after we move away from that dramatic, kind of set piece opener with Joe Kennedy, um, then we kind of, the book is structured around different people coming at this topic from
mhm,
different angles. We've got Vietnam pilot,
mhm,
we've got a peace activist,
right.
we've got a CIA analyst. Can you explain why, your cast of characters, as it were, like how you came, like how that was, you just decided to structure this story around them? And of course, cannot forget, I don't want to call him an egghead, but was it Weldon Word?
Yeah.
This guy, and he's like the through line throughout the whole story, from
Hmm.
Texas Instruments, and what a mind, and what
Right.
yeah, but I was just
Yeah.
I'll let you take the stage on your characters here. Real
Well,
life
so
characters.
real life characters. So Weldon kind of had to be in it because he is the mastermind behind the paveway, behind the specific weapon that is the through line, and also because he was just such a a true visionary,
Mhm,
and and was able to see and project technologies maturing, even ones that he had no control over, and how to position his company, which was Texas Instruments, to sort of take advantage or help this military problem that might develop in 2 decades. Um, but the other characters, the other people, um, there would be sort of put together a map of different conflicts or incidents in which this weapon was used, um, and went through the different sub storylines to each of them. I thought, again, because my own interest is in telling the stories of people, and I had at least a plausible reason why that was kind of core to the purpose of the book. So I wanted to choose people who had stories that were either meaningful or compelling, or tragic in a meaningful way, or all three, but have them be very integral to some aspect of the paveway's use or development or maturation. Um, so uh, and I probably reported and wrote four different people's stories for each one part that ended up having only one. But
mhm,
um, there's a spy versus spy story that's set in East Berlin. It's a Stasi officer who's
yeah,
kind of chasing a Libyan terrorist cell, um, and that is significant for the overall arc of the book because there's an attack that happens in Berlin that ends up instigating one of the first incidences of preemptive war when Reagan orders a strike um, on Libya, with whom we are not at war, but who seems clearly to be behind a lot of terrorist acts. And that story in East Berlin is also there's this aspect of it that is sort of sideways, which is that the Stasi officer is sort of an unwitting ally of the U.S. because he has his own ulterior motives for why he's paying extra attention to the Libyans. And even though we're, of course, in the midst of the Cold War, and the Stasi is a key proxy of the Soviet Union and the KGB, they're actually sort of unlikely allies.
mhm,
There's a story about Kathy Kelly, who's this really amazing person, who's this peace activist who goes to all these war zones and often like literally tries to get in the way of the bombs. And she's
mhm.
um, just this sort of wonderful, interesting person who's, I think you'd sort of expect someone like her to be a bit of a martyr and a bit self-righteous, but she's just sort of an Indiana Jones type who, who
Yeah,
goes out and does the thing. And I think of her almost as like a warrior poet, like an
yeah,
anti-warrior poet. Um, and she's, broken into nuclear missile facilities to protest. She's gone to Iraq and the Balkans and everywhere to kind of put her money where her mouth is. And it's sort of the conscience of the book.
absolutely. That came through
And
very clearly. She was kind of a hero to me as well. Um,
mm,
uh, yeah, the human stories in here are and they're also they all touch each other, you know, and they're all woven in together so well. But maybe we should, just because I'm very well versed in the book, let's go back
Mhm.
to the technology and how it developed, and also the name Paveway. You know,
Mhm.
where did that come from? Just if you can start us off on that road with Weldon and Texas Instruments, where I only think of calculators when I think of
Yeah,
Texas
I
Instruments,
did too. Again,
and
I
here they
so did I.
were. Yeah.
Yeah. So I, zooming forward a little bit to me being in Yemen again at the what would be the tail end chronologically of the story, but is of course the beginning of my journey. Um, Finding out that this bomb that was used in this airstrike in Yemen was made by a company called Raytheon, and then just doing a really cursory amount of research and seeing, but invented by TI,
Okay.
other TI, like that they, I wonder if the calculator company knows that there's a company that also invented weapons with the same name. But it turns out it was Texas Instruments. It was the calculator company,
Yeah.
and in fact, this bomb, and the calculator, arguably to Texas Instruments, were sort of almost the same product or the same purpose, which was, and there's a number of threads that come together involving Operation Paperclip and Werner von Braun and the Nazi vengeance weapon program that the U.S. is trying to modify into a rocket program that then becomes the Mercury rocket that takes the
Mhm.
Apollo missions to space and the intercontinental ballistic missiles. But all of these things come together with Texas Instruments having placed a really large bet on trying to be the first to figure out how to make a transistor out of silicon, basically the first semiconductor, the first
Mhm.
silicon computer chip. Um, they had not invented the idea of a transistor, but the transistors had largely been made out of germanium, um, which was a less ideal but easier to work with element. And there was a sort of understanding that if we could figure out how to do this with silicon, which is more plentiful and theoretically better, but has its own limitations, then we can be the first to market with this product, the silicon semiconductor, which we don't know what it can do. We just know it's going to be revolutionary. And they essentially they solved the problem, but the cost was so high that in order to spark any kind of consumer market, they
Mhm.
needed to find a way to bring the cost way down,
Yeah.
um, which meant trying to find a customer who was willing to buy a new and relatively unproven product in enough volume that they could bring the per unit cost down.
Yeah.
And so they were looking essentially for wrapping paper, for packaging for this product. What are some things that will contain the silicon semiconductor, but in a package that someone might want to buy.
Yeah.
And two of the solutions they came up with, to make a long story slightly less long, was calculator
Mhm.
and weapons for the Defense Department. Um,
Makes
so
sense, right? I mean, calculators.
right,
Weapons.
because you have this weird thing where, like, geometry students or whatever and the Air Force are both, without knowing it, helping to spark the personal computing revolution. Um,
Yes. Mhm. Mhm.
but it leads to this kind of interesting dynamic where Texas Instruments sends Weldon Word down to an Air Force base,
Mhm.
to try to drum up some business, to try
Yeah.
to find a weapon they can help work on, or maybe one they can invent. And everyone, all of the major players, all of the major, giant behemoth defense contractors, and to a large extent the military also, looks at Texas Instruments the way you and I just did.
Yeah.
These are like nerds. These are electronic nerds. What are they doing here?
Right.
um, and it was very hard for them on the Air Force Base to get much attention. It was hard for them to get, wind tunnel time or whatever. It was hard for them to get
Yeah.
the resources they need. And so, partially by design, because Weldon and a small team of people he put together were thinking along these strategic lines, but partially just out of necessity, they just kind of had to scrap things together and find a way to build a weapon that was inexpensive and very simple to use, because they kind of had no other option. They
Mhm.
found this one kind of unlikely ally, an Air Force colonel who was really consumed with the plight of, um, with Air Force aviators over Vietnam who were getting shot down in really high numbers. He's really, really motivated to try to get them a tool that would make it a little bit easier for them to carry out airstrikes without having to get, for example, get really close to into range of all the anti-aircraft artillery and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So this guy, this colonel, and Weldon started working together. And I think that this colonel had we tried it the conventional way. We've tried it with all these giant defense behemoths.
Right.
I don't really know who these guys are either, but like maybe they'll come at it from a different way. And
Mm-hmm.
and that's ultimately what happened. Weldon sort of brought together this one emerging technology that no one had quite figured out a way to use, laser, silicon semiconductor, and come up with arguably the first actually effective, usable guided weapon, the first precision weapon, first smart bomb.
Right. And this had to do with the Dragon's Jaw,
Yes.
right? Okay.
Yeah.
Yes. And this was Rick
Yeah.
Hilton, the pilot.
Yes. Yep. Good
Okay.
memory. Yep.
Yeah, fantastic
Yeah.
stuff. Yes, I'm probably not pronouncing the name of the bridge itself, but is it Tan Ho Bridge?
Tianhua. Yeah.
Tanhua Bridge,
Yeah.
but it's also known as the Dragon's Jaw by
Mm-hmm.
the American pilots. They were constantly getting shot down, but it was a key bridge that they really needed to just destroy. And
Mm-hmm.
every time they go on these bombing runs, guys weren't coming back because the anti-aircraft artillery
Mm-hmm.
was just taking them out. And they
Mm-hmm.
tried a bunch of different things, but nothing worked
Mm-hmm.
until Weldon Word came along.
Right.
I remember reading this section of your book, and I was so enthralled by it. I'm like, I've got to get another book on this. I got to find another book about the Dragon's Jaw because I just want to read about this more. It was just
Mm-hmm.
amazing.
There are some good ones that I've really benefited from. Kuntz wrote one. I mean, there's some.
Yeah, that's the book I want to get. I haven't read that one yet, but I had seen it before I read your book. And then when I read this section, I'm like, Dragon's Jaw. I'm like, I remember seeing that book title somewhere.
I will separately, I will send you some sourcing on that. It would be good for me to do because like every project I work on, again, because I'm like never an expert in the thing, I'm always kind of standing on the shoulders of people who've done a lot of research and reporting first.
Mm-hmm.
So I wouldn't have known anything about the bridge either if I hadn't read, a bunch of different books. So
wow.
that's a good
That'd
way
be great. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. So in this case, like you were saying, this is that was an aspect of the development of technology where in this case it was destroying a bridge, but it was saving lives. It was saving lives of the American pilots.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think at that stage people were understanding, especially in the Air Force and the defense industry, that are like, hey, there's something here. We can expand this beyond just this bridge destroying run. This one operation to destroy a bridge. Can we apply this in larger ways? Just looking at my questions here. If we can even just see, I could talk about this book for hours, so I know I got to keep it focused. But when did the technology actually start to leave the sphere of military use and into people's smartphones and things like this? It became a tool that people could use just to find your directions to the whatever.
So all right, so I'll break this up into two parts. I think that the implications for this weapon and the capability represented was fairly immediate. This is not a expert, general speaking now, but my sense is that the response, just like the almost emotional way that some of the early reports were interacted with that came back from Vietnam, were as if it was literally a revolution, almost overnight. And I think you could argue that bombing technology hadn't changed as much as we'd like to think between, for example, World War II and Vietnam up to that point. So when you take something like this bridge, Dragon's Jaw Bridge, which is a stand-in for, I mean, it represents a problem they were facing with other bridges and other small targets, but also was genuinely considered a really key strategic, um, both a key strategic target, and also it had become kind of representative and symbolic because people kept getting shot down, and like a whole mythology rose around it.
Hmm.
So it was both for morale and tactically and strategically really important. Um, it's very small. I mean, it's a bridge. It's several meters wide,
Yep.
and as you said, it was really heavily defended. Um, and there were some fairly novel methods that were attempted. Um, Floating mines dropped
Yeah.
upstream to go under the, you know, um,
Yeah, I read that one. I was like, oh wow, we were trying everything.
we're
Started
trying
taking a
everything.
think at it.
Yeah. These really massive dual axis attacks where you had, the Navy and the Air Force all kind of intersecting with dozens and dozens of planes and multiple elements coming in and just dropping masses of, huge amount of ordnance, in a way that wasn't necessarily all that different from sort of the carpet bombing. And then largely the most effective thing was still almost dive bombing. You'd have to get really close to the bridge,
Hmm.
in order to drop a dumb bomb and try to put it on the bridge. It was hard to do that from high up, which means you had to get really low and within range of all sorts of different
Yes.
different.
Yep.
The lower you went, the more artillery you're in range of, and then also, um, if you don't pull up fast enough, you might hit the ground.
Hmm.
But if
Hmm.
you pull up too fast, then you can like literally strip the wings off the plane because of the forces on the. So the ability to stay at 10, 15, 20,000 feet
Yeah.
and still put a weapon on a precise target, um, which they just hadn't been able to do before. There had been other kinds of guided weapons they had tried, but this paveway, this Weldon word creation, was the first one that really worked. And
Hmm.
one of the ways that bombing effectiveness and accuracy is measured is circular error probability.
Hmm.
It's this term of which I think it's like the percentage of weapons that fall within the whatever, we can fact check this, but it's like maybe it's like
Yeah.
50% more weapons fall within this range. Um, so the circular error probability had been in the hundreds of feet, before,
Mm.
and in the first strike and then the early subsequent strikes after the Dragon's Jaw, it was down to something like 3 or 4 meters, um,
Hmm.
and that the implications were massive. It meant that we might now have the capability to strike really precise targets from far away. And to the
Yeah.
extent that anyone was thinking about, the impact on civilians, it was positive because it was we'll be able to engage targets with less likelihood of collateral damage.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah. And remind me too, just because I remember, the scenes in the book like that, but was it based off of coordinates of or was there also
right,
something dropped ahead of time, like a homing, because you
right,
talked about like the
yeah,
mother and the baby and the early technology,
yeah,
but for that bomb to hit,
right.
what was it homing
So
in on?
previous to this, one of the types of guided weapons that had been attempted and just hadn't been as effective was almost a direct descendant of that mother and baby. It was a weapon that one was a weapon that actually had would send a video feed, and so you'd be steering the weapon to the target. One was, a weapon that kind of released a flare, and you'd sort of steer it based on, and those just weren't that effective. This one
Mhm.
was laser guided. So there'd be either
Okay.
the pilot or more likely the weapon system officer behind the pilot, who would have a laser slaved to a video camera,
Mhm.
and would be looking at the ground at the target, and when the weapons were released, would engage the laser. And the bomb has, and this sounds very complicated, but it actually wasn't. It has a photon sensor on the
Mhm.
front. Um, and the photon sensor is essentially connected to an actuator. So what's happening is the bomb is looking for the laser reflection,
Gotcha.
and if the right I guess in layman's terms, if the right side of the photon sensor is picking up the reflection, then the signal gets sent for the fins to kick the other way, so it steers more that way.
That's
And
right.
it's steered by what's called sinusoidal glide, which is basically just means it's constantly going back and forth. It's
Mm-hmm.
just zigzagging down. It's going, I'm too far right, I'm too far left, I'm too far right.
Okay. Constantly
So
correcting. Right.
constantly correcting.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but all that needs to happen is the laser needs to work and the weapon system officer needs to keep the laser on the target, um, which was much more effective than anything that happened before. It was not perfect. And this is actually sort of a segue to your other question, because there are still some obstacles. One is it does mean that the weapon system officer has to keep the laser on the target until the weapon is hit.
Right.
So you can't really, at the time, you couldn't really, it wasn't quite fire and forget, right? I mean, it
Mm-hmm.
was much better because you didn't have to get nearly as low, but you couldn't leave. You needed to
Yeah.
stay close enough. But another thing is that I mean, the laser still has to have line of sight. It can still be obstructed by dust and debris. If
Mm-hmm.
you can't see the target because of weather, which was a huge issue in Vietnam, especially on the Dragon's Jaw, you can't put a laser on something you can't see.
Right.
So there were a number of different solutions that ultimately came about. One was just the ability, and this was almost immediate, but was to have one weapon system officer with one laser steering multiple weapons, so that, okay, theoretically, maybe 4 planes are dropping bombs, but only one really needs to stay with its laser signal.
Yeah.
That was ultimately upgraded to being able to have different paveways pursuing different laser signals, which meant we could all drop our bombs at the same time, and these ones can chase that target, and these ones can chase that target.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the solutions was GPS. And
Okay.
so this was the idea that, like you said, you could have it coordinate based. So
Mm-hmm.
you just have the GPS coordinates, you drop the bomb, and it pursues it on its own. They're not they were not as precise, and it required it would require more computing power.
Yeah.
But at least in theory, for a while, that would solve the visibility problem.
Mm-hmm.
The answer to the other part of your question, though, one of the tricky things about that was that, so as Weldon Word and the Paveway team, um, a couple of decades, about 10 years after the first Paveway, maybe a little bit more than that, began trying to come up with this solution and saw the idea of guiding something by a satellite signal as a potential solution. They were reliant on a lot of factors outside of their control. One of which was that at the time they really started seriously considering GPS, the technology existed, but it wasn't global. It wasn't a global positioning system.
Okay.
First of all, you needed a pretty big, heavy receiver. And second of all, it was only as effective as the satellite coverage allowed. And
Mm-hmm.
there was not a complete satellite constellation. And in fact, so the Air Force was in charge of getting the data satellite, of essentially overseeing the manufacture of the data satellites,
Mm-hmm.
but was using NASA to deliver the satellites to space, and
Okay. Yeah.
specifically the Challenger
Yes.
Space Shuttle.
I was just going to mention that next.
Right. So one of the tragedies of the Challenger disaster was that it also set back the ability to steer things by GPS, because it delayed a full satellite constellation for like true global coverage.
Okay.
So the first GPS guided weapons were used in Desert Storm in 1991, but it still
Okay.
wasn't a complete constellation until the mid 90s. But to your point, part of the process of miniaturizing and modernizing the GPS receiver so you could, for example, fit it on a bomb,
Mm-hmm.
led to Texas Instruments also designing the chipsets that were used, in a bunch of different models of the iPhone, and other smartphones, to
Yeah.
be able to, order your food or call a Uber.
That's right.
So,
That's right. Okay. Well, that it kind of explains too how it evolved out of that Well, like you said, the technology was always improving,
Hmm.
right? As soon as they realized, well, the laser is good unless there's barriers, there's
Hmm.
obstacles. So then they would think through that problem,
Hmm.
um, or Weldon would, and like, well, what can we do next? And so, but yeah, you mentioned Challenger, but you also covered Apollo.
Hmm.
Um, there's even Walt Disney in here.
Right. Yeah.
um, but how did you find yourself with so many options to include in this book as far as like the historical threads?
Yes.
And what to use and what to leave out?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. A lot of killing darlings, to say.
Oh no.
Um,
Yeah.
it required a really good editor, a friend and brilliant guy named Andy Keifer, who not only a uh, not only a really brilliant editor, but a bit of a therapist too, finding different ways to help me find peace with. I spent 2 years working on this thing. Now we're just
Oh,
going to cut it. Um, but
no.
that's part of the process, and also I think it requires. I'll have 17 different ideas of how we should follow this story, and it will intersect ultimately with this one. But it may not be as clear to a reader as it is to
Mhm.
me, and
Right.
and and so there was a lot of taking the pieces totally apart and reassembling them, so that the history of paveway is sort of told and is clear, but also it's not I didn't want it to be a history book. I want to be about these people, so to be able to tell these stories in a way that hopefully doesn't make it just like, here's an interesting thing, here's an interesting thing, but it's building both the history of the weapon, the history of the how it affects technology, and technology affects uh, geopolitics, and then ultimately, hopefully, people.
Absolutely. And you did all three of those things, just wonderfully.
Thank
And
you.
yeah, I can only just re-stress what um, Jeff has said here, everybody, that it is definitely humans make up this story. It is storytelling that I just loved it. Just gonna say,
Thank you
just
so much.
let me just say, yeah, I read a lot of books, both for pleasure and for reviewing, and sometimes those two things go together. And sometimes they don't. But with this one, I was just like, this was an outstanding reading and educational experience for me. So I really just appreciated how you wrapped up this story about technology and then tied it in with its impact on people. Because in the end, it really comes back to it in the end, it comes back to the beginning.
Mhm.
When that man said, touch my face,
Mhm.
I've got shrapnel
Yeah.
here.
Yeah.
So we should never forget how technology can be used for good, but how when it's in the wrong hands or misguided, decision making, it can be used for ill
Mhm.
and it can really hurt people. Which makes
Yeah.
us rethink that question about smart weapons. Like, I'd love if you could just riff on that for a little bit. I mean, do you feel like the way we use language around this type of like, it's a precision strike, it's a
Mhm.
smart weapon, which seems to imply there's no casualties really. I mean,
Mhm.
we are precision, we are
Right.
not about taking out, you know, undue amounts of, people on the ground, but really it's a smokescreen in many
Yeah, I
ways.
think that's such a good point. I think there's a thing that rhymes between the language that we use to sterilize what's happening, and
Mhm,
how the technology does that on its own. I mean, it's easier to hit a pickle button in a trailer when you're looking at black and white or infrared readout of bad guys with turbans somewhere far away.
mhm,
Um, and it's easier if you're saying targets engaged or hostiles destroyed,
mhm.
than okay, mother of three who's working on her bachelor or whatever of arts is being,
Yeah,
um, and perhaps in some way that's sort of psychologically necessary to have a military that does anything.
mhm,
But it's such a slippery slope. And I think another thing is, even if we're not, even to sort of remove any sort of like, well, this is a indulgence in, in a sense of humanity that is a luxury we can't all have because there are real threats out there. One of the, I think, strategic implications of this is it makes it so easy, both psychologically but also practically, to engage in new conflicts without a lot of discretion, without a lot of deliberation, even.
Mhm.
And so I think one of the things we're seeing now is, the U.S. is engaging in a lot more conflicts, arguably, than it has before,
Yeah.
because in the beginning it seemed so easy and painless and bloodless, and we are getting pulled into conflicts that there's uh, not necessarily an easy way out of. Um, so the temptation, the fact that a weapon like this, described in language like you mentioned, can kind of argue for its own use, because it presents a scenario in which there's only upside. There's only bad guys dispatched, and there's no bystanders destroyed. There's no it sort of foments that sense, and it just allows it psychologically allows us to sort of maintain the illusion that we can go in for a couple days to country XYZ, take out the bad guys, come home, and the reality is rarely that. Um, and then on a more practical level, it's it's way easier to use a weapon like Paveway on a plane or a drone, and to make that decision with a few people in the White House than it is to do what you would have had to do a generation ago, which was mobilize a battalion or something, and
Mhm.
move tens of thousands of troops. You can't really do that in secret. Practically, you can't really do that without allies or congressional oversight.
Right.
Um, and now you can.
Well, and I feel like we're dancing around a big elephant in the room.
Hmm. Yeah.
With and I don't know if you're able to speak to any of this, but, what talk about something that you can't easily
Yeah.
extract yourself from is what's going on in Iran, right?
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
I don't know if I mean, I have heard that we're running out of we're running out of weaponry and missiles. Is this
Yeah. And there's an asymmetry here, because I think part of the legacy of Paveway is weapons that are precise but also easy to use and inexpensive. And one of the cat and mouse games that uh, at least accelerated, if not inaugurated, was, all right. Well, if you have this, I need to build a better way to defend myself against that.
yeah.
Um, and so, for example, that could be, well, we're going to build better surface to air missiles. And so we say, okay, well, we're going to put paveways on these new things called stealth bombers, which you're not even going to be able to see.
Right.
Um, now we have
Mhm.
we have stealth bombers, we have weapons, but other people are building better reinforced bunkers. So now we're developing a bunker buster weapon. And all of these things are way more expensive to defend against than they are to, even the most advanced, technologically sophisticated version of Paveway was something like $100,000, and most of them stayed roughly around the cost of a family sedan. That was always it has to be, low
Mhm.
cost. It has to, um, but it costs a lot more than that to build a surface to air missile. It costs a lot more than that to reinforce a bunker. Now we're seeing, um, I mean, we saw this with Ukraine, but we're seeing with Russia and Iran, these $30,000, $40,000 drones, kamikaze drones, that we're trying to shoot down with, $15 million fighter jets, or with THAAD systems that are something like billions of dollars and millions for each round,
Right.
um, and also take a while to build. So offensive capability seems to always be way easier and cheaper to deploy than defensive technology.
Okay.
Um,
Mhm. Mhm.
but I think, to your point also, that Iran is really a a really striking kind of manifestation of exactly what we're trying to warn about here, which is, if I told you, hey, we can destroy Iran's nuclear program overnight, no cost to civilians. We're just going to use this really advanced weapon. We're going to get in and get out,
Yeah.
and that's going to be it. Then, like, I think most of us would say, yeah, let's do it. Um, and that, because of the language we describe it with, as you were saying, because
Mhm.
of the promise that this technology kind of presents, um, that's, I mean, I'm exaggerating obviously, but that kind of is the offer. That kind of is the sort of sense of what we have the ability to do.
Yeah.
And I mean, I feel strongly, and I'd argue that it is that uh, largely illusory promise that draws us into these conflicts, which of course in reality are way more complicated, harder to get out of, and have knock-on effects for years, if not generations.
Mhm.
That were it not so ostensibly easy and precise and clean, um, there would have been a lot more deliberation before
Right.
engaging.
Now we're making going to war so much
Right,
easier to do. I wanna say
right,
easier, but, I mean, and that just has, big moral implications
yeah,
for
yeah,
countries, for individuals. I mean, there has to be the psychological fallout too of, I mean, there have been recent books written about this aspect of what they call desk killers. Have
mm,
you heard that phrase? Like, well, it basically just means because you're at that console and your
yeah,
target is 1,000 miles away, and you are
right,
so just disconnected from the act of pushing a button,
right.
but it has impacted people
Hmm. Yeah, I mean,
psychologically.
there's a term, drone pilot fatigue, um,
Oh, yeah. Yes.
and I'm, sort of a facile. I'm using sort of like, oh, the 18-year-old private in the air conditioned trailer, but also for people who are doing that, who are drone pilots, if they are in some Air Force base, in the East or West Coast or whatever, they're
Mhm.
going home to their families for, family dinner
Mm.
20 minutes after having taken out a, wedding party or whatever. Um,
Yep.
there's a cost to that too.
Mhm.
Um, and I think also another thing that's worth mentioning is, um, I also think one of the legacies, in addition to making it appear easier to start or engage in a foreign conflict, it also this weapon, this capability presents the sort of promise of not requiring our humans to be on the ground. If you remember early on in Operation Epic Fury, it was sort of presented as it was going to be this sort of like hands-off, airstrikes, Tomahawk missiles, and then there began to be this conversation of like troops of boots on the ground,
Yeah.
um, which everyone was against. No one wants our people in harm's way, but there's a number of different examples of this where this happened in Libya when we intervened in Libya,
Mhm.
and it was just supposed to be no-fly zone, NATO helping to airstrikes to weaken Gaddafi forces. We weren't allowed, and we weren't going to need to put boots on the ground. And there what we found was, well, we were pretty effective at destroying regime technicals or driving regime forces back from some position, but then they would just come back. You still needed boots on the ground to at least
Yeah.
maintain the gains, and it created
Mhm.
this vacuum. So it's there's a an obvious appeal to the idea of being able to dispatch an enemy without having to put anyone of our own troops on the ground, and
Yeah.
often that's not the reality. Often
Mhm.
all you're doing is creating the need, creating a vacuum that your troops need to go into.
Right. Right. That is so true, and then, of course, we hear well, every day there's something different, but
Mm,
now it's like, "We're gonna take Carg Island," and it's just like,
right.
"Okay. Good
Exactly.
luck with that."
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
one of the things I think you do with this book, which is fantastic, is you let the reader decide, to make your own decisions about what they've read. You put them inside these difficult questions, and you made me rethink a lot of things too. And it's just, it's very sobering, and you just don't know, where do we go from here?
Hmm.
Is it going to will there be a sense of let's rein this in a bit. Let's get back to deliberating together. Do you see are there any hints or indications that people are starting to rethink the use of smart weapons, or is this just going to be more of the same and maybe even more sophisticated as we get along? I mean, I don't even know how more sophisticated we can get.
Yeah. I think all the inertia is on the side of increased sophistication, more collapsed kill chain, weapons that are easy to use into weapons that use themselves, into autonomous weapon systems. You can make, we hear the argument that if China is developing faster AI weapons or whatever, we need to because we can't be behind,
Right. Oh, yeah.
or
Mm-hmm.
we'll be at a disadvantage.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a difficult position uh, for a war planner or for someone responsible for outfitting the military to be in, because I find that convincing.
Yeah.
The same time, I think there needs, and we are seeing some hopeful signs. I mean, one of the things that happened with the OpenAI versus Anthropic contracts with the Pentagon, where
Mm-hmm.
Anthropic got a lot of positive attention for saying, essentially, we're not going to allow our systems, we're not going to agree to a deal with you if you can't guarantee that our systems won't be used in these specific applications, one of which I think was domestic surveillance, and one was
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
decisions to engage. I think the fact that seemed to be so good for Anthropic and reputationally bad for OpenAI is ultimately a good sign.
Yeah.
But I think it takes. So I do think there's a lot of really thoughtful people who have this sort of sensibility. But part of the reason why I want to steer away from, oh, well, weapons are bad and it's bad people who make them, and
Mm-hmm.
more into like, look at this, look at Weldon Word, who's this genius, he's a brilliant guy, he's thoughtful,
Mm-hmm.
he's selfless, he's thinking of young pilots who are getting shot down, he's thinking of
Yeah.
civilians who get killed because we don't have precise weapons. But that's, I'd argue, most people who are developing weapons, very few of them are saying, I want to kill more innocent people. It's,
Yeah.
I
No,
want
totally. Mm-hmm.
to, but the more advanced the weapon is, the more capability it either has or promises to have, the more likely we are to use it, and potentially in places and at times where it would have been better, discretion is the better part of valor.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, this is come across as a bit of an evasive answer, but I do think awareness, and the it's if there is a break on this, it's ultimately going to come from people. It's going to be, it's going to come
Mm-hmm.
from voters, from citizens. And so,
Mm-hmm.
in the sort of grandiose, self-righteous book that the way that the book is composed, I wanted you on board with Kennedy. I wanted you on board with Rick Hilton. I wanted you to feel what it was like with someone that I think most people would be sympathetic to, on missions that most people would be sympathetic to, and who are in grave danger because they don't have this capability. So I
Right.
want you to kind of be leaning forward to want this thing to be invented,
Mm-hmm.
so that, when the first time you see some of the really horrible effects of it, you're not able to blame it on some villain. You've
Yeah.
been leaning in, you've wanted this thing to come about, and so this is on
Mm-hmm.
us.
So it's on us. Yes. So
Mhm.
you do set up this, I don't want to say it's a trap.
It is.
But okay, it is.
Yeah.
But yeah, you kind of say, look, it's not just this one person with this idea, because we all wanted it. So
Hmm.
let's own it together,
Yeah.
and then use it
Hmm.
responsibly as much as we
Yeah.
can. Because you just
Yeah.
answered my next question, which was, what would you like to have readers come away with, as they're wrestling with the story? And I guess it's a sense of,
Of like having to buy 3 more copies of the book. Yeah,
yes,
it's
absolutely. 3 more copies, folks. Um, um, well, I agree with that.
it's a reminder of that there are uh, jealous, complicated, funny, kind, complex humans on
Mhm.
on the receiving end, on the deploying end, on the inventing end,
Yeah.
that this seems so obvious, but that when we are pulling, pushing the button, no matter how objectively bad the bad guy is that we're going after, the people standing next to him are likely people who you might know, there are people like you
Yeah.
might know. There are people who might be like your family, and they have
Yep.
different names and different cultures or whatever. But just a reminder of the sort of complexity of the human experience and all elements of that, um, because I do think that like it, there is a lot stacked against us in remembering that. As obvious as it seems, it's the language like you're talking about. It's the
Mhm.
technology. It's the fact that we can be shown. When these weapons were first kind of had their coming out in Desert Storm, and we saw this happening.
Mhm.
We thought we saw what was happening, but really what we were seeing was targeting pod footage, or cool videos of jets taking off from aircraft carriers. We weren't
Yep.
seeing people. We weren't seeing what it was like on the ground. There's a temptation that all of us, that I fall into, of oh good, we're hitting the bad guys and that's all.
Yeah.
Um, and I think it requires some discipline and constant reminder that it's people, that it's
It's
people on the
people.
other end.
We call people collateral damage, I
Mm-hmm.
mean, again, another use of, like, the semantics of it, just to kind of clean it
Exactly.
up, sanitize
Exactly.
it. Um,
Yeah.
but we should always remember there is someone physically either destroyed by these things, or they're
Mm-hmm.
standing too close to something that's going off. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I saw
Exactly.
footage of, the precision strikes of, like Israel did in like a hotel, but like they took out one floor and left the rest of the,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm like,
Yeah.
"Wow, that's amazing," but at the same time, I'm like, I'm sure there were several people that were not, they were,
Yeah.
they were taken out as well. I mean, so it's just like war is never clean, and that's
Yeah.
just the bottom line. I mean, it's just war is, it's bad. It's death.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's bad.
And
But at the same
the
time,
most.
I was just gonna
Go
say,
ahead.
you really highlighted the high the you brought in just the fact that the human ingenuity to me, which was astounding, and it's an area of where you're like, "Wow, someone really thought of this up. This is amazing," you know?
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I really appreciated that aspect where it's creativity, it's, so you see, like, the highs of the human state, and
Mm-hmm.
then you see the lows
Mm-hmm.
as well. So you kind
Yeah.
of explore both the peaks and valleys, as it were.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, again, I mean, I don't think many people want to read, and I don't really want to write about, you know, equations and technology, and
Yeah,
it's the
it's the people.
it's the
And
people.
I was gonna ask you too, just on a writing standpoint, have you ever written any type of, like, fiction or anything? Because you have scenes in here which are very gripping, and they're written very much like novelistic, and, I'm just curious, just, for my own, this is my question, I'm just curious
Yeah,
if you have any experience writing fiction or.
I appreciate the question. It's funny, someone else just brought that up recently, and I've periodically dabbled with, doing an adaptation of something that I researched or an article, um, and have always felt it was a little bit indulgent. But I think especially with this book, where it's so important to make it narrative, and yet it's also really hard to make it both narrative and survive fact checking. How to put someone in the cockpit when you need three corroborating sources for every time the person looks to the left or looks to the right. Um,
Mhm.
so I'm just beginning a new project that is sort of exploring a fictionalized take on it's a totally
Okay.
unrelated scene and setting, but I'm going to take that question as permission to to continue this little journey of fiction, and I will let you know if it
Oh,
goes
please
anywhere.
do,
Hmm.
Jeff, please do. In fact,
Okay.
yeah, that was my next question, is like, what are you working on next? Oh, I'm intrigued. So if you're not ready to say what it's about now, let me know in an email or
I will.
something.
You'll be the first to know. I will probably tell you too soon before the thing is done anyway. But I'm gonna pretend like I have that discretion of like, well, it's not ready yet, so I'm not gonna tell
You're
you about
right.
it.
Well, you let me know, and I will be here when the book does come out, and I would love to
Great.
have you back on,
I'd love to be back. It's great talking to you. I really appreciate you reading and you talking about it and you bringing up such like the detailed things that is like, why did I spend so much time doing this? No one's going to figure it out. And then having you sort of reflect that back is really validating. I really appreciate it.
Oh, well, I'm really happy to hear that because it's just, we're the reader, you're the writer. But what we get from the book, you may not know because, you're kind of separated
Hmm.
outside of these interviews that you do, you're kind of separated from like the reader experience, unless someone takes the time to email you or to say, look, I read your book and it was amazing. As a book reviewer, I get that opportunity. So that's fantastic. And my channel, because I've shown your book several times on the channel and
Yeah.
just talking about new books or what I'm reading and which books are really having, resonating with me. But it's nice to know that, the best thing I can do as a book reviewer or a reader is just to get that's what authors, when they do email me, they're like, you got what I was trying to do.
Yeah. Yeah.
And to me,
Yeah.
it's like, that's the highest praise. Then that's what I want to do.
Yeah.
I want to be able to get your
Oh,
intent.
yeah, well, you did, and I really don't take it for granted. I mean, first of all, it's hard to find the time to read a book, let alone all the books that you do and shine a light on. And second of all, I'd like to be the kind of writer who's like, I'm just doing this for me, and I don't need anyone to. And I'm almost there, but also on some level, it is an act of communication. And so having one person be like, I got it. I spent the time with it, and you talk to me is like kind of all that I need. So
Uh,
thank you.
oh, well, you're welcome, Jeff. And I'm going to hold this book up again because,
Mhm.
yeah, this is like one of my best reads of the year so far, and I think it's going to remain there. It will. It's not moving. It's up there. I'll probably make a best of, towards the end of the year, and we're going to revisit the Warhead again.
Amazing.
Yes, everybody, please check out the Warhead by Jeffrey Stern, subtitled "The Quest to Build the Perfect Weapon in the Age of Modern Warfare." But again, know that this book is narrative nonfiction that is done right. It just pulls you in. The stories are gripping. I was looking through your this reveals what a nerd I am. Let's see here. Looking through all of your notes, because I love to read about sources.
Hmm.
So yeah, if you want to send me some of your other
I'm going
sources,
to.
okay,
Yeah.
because I just love to keep reading and learning more. But
Yeah.
this was fantastic. You'll learn about technology, human ingenuity, um, the good, the bad, the ugly, but also just it asks you to kind of wrestle with the issues of smart weaponry and precision and what that looks like. But I thank you for staying with me for a whole hour or
No,
more.
thank you, Beck. Thank you so much. This is great. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. And we'll have you back on when your next book comes out.
Okay.
All
I'll hold
right.
you to that. All right.
Well, thanks for joining us, everyone out there, for this author interview. Again, check out The Warhead by Jeffrey Stern, and we'll see you back here soon. Bye.